So I'm going to talk about building a private supermarket in your organization. Now, I work at a company called New Context. We do infrastructure and DevOpsy stuff and security, and it's really cool because it gives you lots of reasons to listen to me. I'm Justin Dawsey. I've been doing this for 20 years. It hasn't always been pretty. I've been writing Ruby code for 10 years. I started a company called Podomatic back in 2005 and decided to take the risk of writing it with Ruby on Rails back in the 0 dot versions. And so Chef came really naturally. Ruby, I can do that. I've been doing configuration management in the modern way since around 2008. I had CF Engine experience back in the late 90s, but that was pretty painful, although Burgess has gotten better with it. And I just built a couple of supermarkets, actually a bunch of them, pretty recently. And so this is really fresh in my mind. And I'd love to share my experiences with you. And my bosses insisted that I put this in because we are hiring, just like most everybody else. We want you. So if you want us, talk to us. So yeah, I alluded to it, but I'm an old school Unix guy. You know, I was writing shell scripts back in the 90s. I was running BBSs before that. And my title, I'm practice owner. That means that I'm responsible for the practice of development and operations. That's really general, and I like that because it kind of lets me make up my own job. And to stay sharp, I consult with multi-billion-dollar corporations and help them get this stuff right. Let's talk about the supermarket. That's why you're here. That is a supermarket. The supermarket was built for Chef as a Ruby on Rails application. It was originally designed to be hosted in AWS. So you'll see stuff in the code that expects AWS. And part of it adopting, and we're going to get into this in more detail, part of adopting a supermarket to your organization, or adapting it to your organization, is keeping in mind what the assumptions were of the developers at the time they built the product. So they've started working on this in October 2013. And in Chef time, that was like 20 years ago, right? So many things have changed since then. I mean, we barely had Berkshelf in 2013. And Chef hired the people who built it as a thing to be hosted by Chef for the public. But as soon as they built it and had it launched, they said, oh my gosh, everybody else wants this too. Let's open source it, and then we'll figure out how to help people actually run this thing. And that also means that stuff like the CLA is like in there at the very beginning. CLA, you know, the Chef contributor licensing agreement that everybody has to sign in order to get Chef code into Chef on GitHub or something like that. And the CLA signing check means that anytime pull request is issued on GitHub for a Chef-owned piece of code, then they need to make sure that all parties of that pull request have signed the CLA in order to continue. We'll get into that more. And these assumptions that I just alluded to also mean that when you're running your own private supermarket, it gets a little funky sometimes, and you have to say, well, what were they expecting, and how can I make that work for me? Okay. You probably already have some ideas about why you want a private supermarket because you're here. And so why would you want to build a private supermarket? These are some of the reasons that I've heard from some of you as well as from other people outside of this room. They write a lot of cookbooks. They have untold numbers of cookbooks. I'll bet you that the people at GE Capital who were just speaking earlier, I was talking to somebody here about, have hundreds of cookbooks. Now, when Joe on that side of the room writes a Redis installation cookbook for X monitoring software, and Alice on that side of the room needs Redis for something else, maybe they can talk to each other, maybe they can collaborate and make a really good Redis cookbook instead of having two, for example. And there's also some worry about the public supermarket code quality. When you have everybody using the public supermarket, then you basically have anarchy. You have developers all over your company, picking versions of cookbooks from the public supermarket and saying, I'm going to support this. Now, implicitly, they're saying, this cookbook isn't going to blow up my infrastructure. But people get nervous about that, you know? So if we formalize this process and say, in order to run a cookbook in our organization, somebody has to give it their stamp of approval and put it into our private artifact store, which is our private supermarket. So if it does blow something up, we can say, Justin did it. And then we can go fire Justin. But that's okay for the company. All right, so there's also the worry about accessibility of the public supermarket. Now, honestly, I think the guys and ladies at Chef are really good at running their own stuff. This stuff doesn't go down very much, if at all. But as an organization, especially as somebody who's not technical, you might say, oh gosh, what if this public supermarket goes down and I have all this infrastructure code that depends on it? So we've got to get this into our own stuff so we can own everything. And then, of course, there's security concerns. You know, what if somebody breaks into the public supermarket and changes something subtly without bumping the version or something, and they manage to make this sit in public for 6 weeks? What happens if we're running this software? What if the computers that are running this software are also responsible for things like, I don't know, centrifuges that produce uranium? You know, this could be a big deal. But if we bring it private, then we own our own security concerns. So I alluded to this earlier. The supermarket is open source. And the reason that we can do a private supermarket so easily is that we can just download the code. Now, Chef makes this pretty easy for us, and I like that. There's not only the supermarket GitHub repo, which you can find that has the code for the Ruby on Rails app itself. There's also several supporting projects, and there's a supermarket cookbook, and there's a supermarket Omnibus installer that they're working on and is ready real soon now. So if they can run it, we can too. But we're not Chef, so we don't really have the same concerns about the CLA, or maybe we don't want to integrate with the public GitHub in exactly the same way. We need to build this into our pipeline. But there's a supermarket cookbook, right? So we can just wrap it. So here's how the supermarket works in a very vague detail. So it's a Ruby on Rails app. I mentioned that earlier. It has Postgres backend. It uses something called .env to pass config into the Ruby on Rails application as environment variables. Basically, .env is a file that gets sourced by shellcode that then launches the Rails app, and then the Rails app can refer to environment variables for things like database passwords and configuration elements. OmniAuth and Devise are public open source authentication frameworks. And there's also some Redis in there, and I believe it's mostly used for things like Sidekick, which is an asynchronous execution framework. So I mentioned this also. Supermarket talks to a lot of stuff. It's a small font because there's so much there. There's OCID, which is how you authenticate to a Chef server, like with OAuth. And it talks to GitHub, so it can link pull requests and GitHub accounts to supermarket accounts. It talks to StatsD, so it can graph information about the supermarket. Remember, these people are running this public supermarket, and gosh, I'll bet you they've got tens of thousands of people using it every day. So all the things that you would need for a site that supports the millions of requests that this generates are in here. Sentry is for error logging, Amazon S3 for storage, Fieri is another Chef project, and oh gosh, I'm trying to remember what that is. Have you ever tried searching for Chef Fieri and expecting code? You get a lot of pictures of people I don't want to see. Okay, but let's see. I wrote down what Fieri was. Oh yeah, Fieri evaluates the code quality of the cookbooks that were uploaded to the supermarket. So That's a little vague, and I'm going to leave it like that. Curry is another Chef application, and all it does is communicate with Chef's legal department to find out who signed the CLA so it can update a record in the database for supermarkets saying this guy's okay. And PubSub Hubbub is something they actually don't even want you to run in production, but it's, it relays stuff for Curry. It's a callback system for notifying people when stuff happens, basically. And then there's the SMTP relay, because Curry sends email to the legal department saying this person signed the CLA, or maybe it goes the other way. New Relic for monitoring. They're in the exhibition hall if you want to talk to them. And Google Analytics so that we can figure out, so Chef can figure out exactly how people use the supermarket and make it more usable. So if you just need some place to stick cookbooks that other people can browse, a lot of this stuff goes away. So here's our minimum working set. Not much left. OCID, I mean, you have to have your own private Chef server to play this game because there's no org level auth or anything like that. It's top level auth. So if you don't run a private Chef server, that means anybody can log into your private supermarket, and that's no good. And the SMTP relay, which you may be able to shut off because we don't really want more email anyway. So, oops, there we go. You configure supermarket using data bags. That's right. And remember, 2013. This is before the Burke Shelf way was really a thing. So for whatever reason, they decided that they wanted to put the configuration data in a data bag. And that's still with us today. And it feels a little bit weird to have to put data bags in place in order to configure a Ruby on Rails application. But at least there's only one. And the format of this thing keeps changing, but the content is about the same. Old stuff like the Redis URL, the SMTP server stuff, a bunch of URLs, which version of supermarket you're running, because the installer in the cookbook uses package cloud repo, which a lot of other Chef stuff does. It kind of acts like a Chef server once you get it installed. But the really important thing there is these OAuth 2 tokens for OCID, because if you don't set that up, then you won't be able to log in. You can stand it up. You'll see the pretty supermarket search and login page, but nobody will be able to log in without OCID. So the stuff that isn't in the data bag that you probably care about are things like the host name of the supermarket, supermarket.mycompany.com or example.org or whatever you want to call it. SSL stuff like certificates, and there are some weird bits of Nginx configuration you're probably going to need to tweak if you want to go all SSL. And you can look through the issues in Supermarket and Supermarket Cookbook to see what that conversation's all about. And also, where you want it installed, how many background threads of Sidekick to run, how big your database is going to be. And also notice I haven't said a word about backups. That's because it's not here. There's no backup stuff built in. If you want backups, you've got to do backups. All right, let's do it ourselves. If you're hoping for a demo, you're not going to get one because I'm too paranoid to run a tech demo. I'm just going to tell you how it's done. So you write a wrapper cookbook. This sounds familiar. I hope it's familiar because this is how we create stuff. We write wrapper cookbooks. We stick attributes and data bag stuff. We write a kitchen YAML. We get the thing stood up to the point of seeing the login page. And I think when I did this, it took me a couple of weeks because the documentation is not all there. And I wound up having to read the source code to figure out how the thing was working. And but the good news is it's Ruby. So if you know Chef, you probably know how to debug the code. There's a production log, there's the .env file, and there's that data bag. And if they all line up, the stars are just right, it will stand up. All right, I mentioned this. We have to be able to authenticate to the Chef server in order to log into the supermarket. There are some workarounds for this in dev, but I wouldn't expect you to run dev stuff in production. You also have to configure the Chef server to allow you to use OCID at all. So this line here that I've handily put up for you says, you add this line to chefserver.rb, run your chef server CTL reconfigure. It puts that very important information into the right spot on the chef server, restarts the appropriate services, and then that will allow us, or allow the person with that username to register an application for OCID. It'll give you an OAuth token that you put into that data bag, upload that data bag to your chef server, and then you can log into that supermarket after that converges. All right. Now, once we have a private supermarket, this allows us to reevaluate how we do CD and CI, which I think is totally awesome. Pipelines, right? Now, here's an old school, simple pipeline. Developer writes their tests, they write the code, the tests pass, they send a PR, the maintainer says, this is great, good job, they merge it, it goes off to Jenkins or some other test runner, and the test runner says, I'm going to run more tests, the tests look great, it looks good, it runs Burks up, it's on the chef server, and then that cookbook is available for use by anybody else who's writing cookbooks, or it's applicable to nodes, that sort of thing. Here's how we would do it with the supermarket. Now, I'm not the best artist, so please forgive me. But it's similar, right? You write your tests, write your code, send your PR, it passes the tests, of course, because you wrote beautiful code. And then instead of simply doing a Burks up, the test runner sends it to the supermarket. Now, there are going to be variations. The bigger your organization is, the more likely this is to change, because you're going to have whatever internal requirements that you know way more about than I do. But at some point, either your test runner or something else does a Burks up and it gets onto the chef server, and the code is also available in the supermarket. Now, I stick the supermarket way over here on this end of it instead of on the other end of it, because we want the code in the supermarket to represent the best stuff that we can turn out. That means that we are reasonably certain this isn't going to break production. I don't like publishing code for the company to use if I'm not 100% sure it's going to work. Did I mention I'm an old school Unix guy? I hate getting woken up at 3 a.m. This is how I don't get woken up at 3 a.m. But there are some sticky situations that arise from this. Now, this guy's pretty talented, by the way. I could stare at this picture for a while. Some people pulled up a lamppost, and he was just walking down the sidewalk. And he went right into it. I think that's pretty awesome. 1 in a million. Okay, so Burkshelf has a flat namespace. That means that there's no priority for this supermarket versus that supermarket. But we can put as many sources as we want into our Burks file. Whatever Burkshelf API endpoints we want to use, we can use them. So if I have an in-house Java cookbook, and then somebody else has the public Java cookbook, there's a bit of a collision here. The only thing we have to differentiate between them is version numbers, and I'm not comfortable with that. So I think the cleanest way to deal with this is to say, if I'm going to use a private supermarket, I'm going to commit to that private supermarket, and I'm not going to use the public supermarket in my Burks files. And that means every cookbook that you use needs to wind up in your private supermarket, even if it came off of the public supermarket. And that means their Burks files are going to get munged a little bit because you have to change the source on those, and all the ones they depend on have to be reviewed. It's a lot of work. So this is not for the faint of heart. And I've talked to the people at Chef about how to deal with this, and I'm not really satisfied with any of the workarounds for it, because once you have 2 completely different cookbooks that have the same name but different versions, it's going to be confusing to somebody. So, my last point here, we give up these namespace collisions, that's great, but now somebody has to approve every upgraded version of every cookbook that gets published on the public internet that we use, that your organization uses, and put those onto the private supermarket, Or maybe clone those into your GitHub and run those through your entire pipeline. So with that pipeline that I had the pretty picture of earlier, the only person or thing that uploads cookbooks is Jenkins. So who owns those cookbooks? If you go to the supermarket and you search for JRandom cookbook, it's going to say Jenkins uploaded it. Jenkins is the cookbook author. Well, clearly, Jenkins isn't writing any cookbooks. So this other feature that Supermarket has where it can tie pull requests to cookbooks and attach GitHub usernames to cookbooks, that all gets messed up because we have this Jenkins user. And so we wind up using the README file to say, if you need to talk about this cookbook to somebody, call Justin. So I also had the chance to talk to the chef people and say, what's coming? And this is my favorite slide for that reason. I get to actually tell you guys something you don't already know. So you guys, you people, I should say, know that these Omnibus packages are increasingly prominent in the chef landscape. And it's cool that you can, if you want, you can run a cookbook and it'll generate a deb and an RPM and that sort of thing. And then you can have simple binary artifacts to pass around, and everything is self-contained. It's almost like containers, which is great. I've built the RPM and deb packages for Supermarket. They're about 900 megabytes, which is not my favorite thing, but at least they come together. Now, I don't recommend yet that you use the Omnibus packages for Supermarket because they're not quite as good as the Supermarket cookbook. And I think you should use the best thing that is around at this moment. But be prepared, it may change. It may be that instead of writing a data bag and all that, you just put the appropriate supermarket.rb file in opt supermarket and run supermarket ctl reconfigure, and you're done. But it's unlikely that any of those integration points, remember that slide with all the cross-outs in it, are going to change because this doesn't affect how we talk to GitHub or Sentry or any of that other stuff. This is still the public supermarket running on your private servers. All right. I guess I'm going pretty quick because I haven't gotten a time warning yet. That's good. It'll mean we have more time for review and for questions. So running a private supermarket means taking this public supermarket and putting it on your servers. And because there were a lot of assumptions that went into building that public supermarket, you may have to make some changes to make it make sense for you in your organization. And you need your own chef server. You've got to do that just to play, but I think there's some people here who will sell you a chef license if you don't already have one. And the namespace and ownership issues are huge. And so before you decide even to download the Supermarket cookbook, think about that stuff and figure out how you're going to approach it, how you're going to integrate the Supermarket into your pipeline, and how you're going to identify and to deal with the risks that this creates and the confusion that it could create. Let's talk. 10 minutes, perfect. I wanted us to have 10 minutes to talk. So now I'm going to answer questions to anyone who has one. Or if you're out of questions.
You mentioned the Java cookbook, there's the Java cookbook in the supermarket, and let's say you have your own Java cookbook and their names are the same and you're not comfortable with the version change, like to differentiate them. How about adding your company's short name to the beginning of the cookbook and making it a convention, everybody who makes a cookbook in your company add the short name of your company to the beginning of the cookbook? What do you think about this solution?
That's generally safe. It's not perfect, in my opinion, though, because all somebody has to do to ruin the whole party is upload a cookbook that is your company's short name -Java to the public supermarket. Game over. And the public supermarket is public. You've got, well, billions of people who could potentially upload cookbooks. and they can name them whatever they want. Does that answer your question?
Hey there. Hey, my name's David. I'm at EchoHack on Twitter. So we run a private supermarket internally, and we made a lot of progress actually back in October at the Community Summit. So I wanted to make folks aware of a couple things. So first of all, there's an awesome thing called a privacy flag that you can add to your metadata. It works very similar to NPM's privacy flag, in that if you try to upload a cookbook to the public supermarket, if you have that privacy flag set, it will not allow you to upload that cookbook to the public supermarket, just in case. And it's, as far as I know, it's implemented. I saw the pull request. Okay, cool. Maybe I should go test it. Let's see. So one question I really have is that the documentation about deploying your own private supermarket to Red Hat type family Linux servers doesn't quite seem to be there at all. Do you have any comment about that, or?
Yes.
Should I go invent it?
I had, the last time I did this, I had supermarket building and installing on CentOS 6.5, I believe, and 6.6, and also on Ubuntu 12.04 and 14.04 LTS. And I remember having to do a good deal of extra work around CentOS because, you know, it sure feels like Chef is building this on Ubuntu-type platforms, Debian, and so this thing that I was talking about where we try to identify the assumptions of the developers and use that information that we have gathered in order to correct the issues that come up when these things break, that's what I would advise. I don't remember exactly what it is I fixed, but it only took about an afternoon. That's the good news. And the privacy flag, that's a big deal. It's a good way of keeping yourself from shooting yourself in the foot. It's like a safety on a pistol or something. Because if you're determined, you're still going to be able to work around it, but there's a pretty good chance that it will save you from accidentally uploading your company's proprietary code to the public supermarket.
As a note on the privacy flag, I think that's implemented in supermarket, but I don't think the corresponding work has been done to make it part of the metadata.rb. So double check on that just as I'm like recalling this patch.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that info, and please everybody double check that before you attempt it.
I'm here, Center.
Thank you.
How hard of a requirement is it to have to run your own private Chef server as well? Like, is it only for the authentication?
Right, it's only for the OCID service.
Okay. And if we can figure out another way to secure the supermarket, we don't need the private Chef.
That is true.
Okay,
that is
cool.
absolutely true.
Thank you.
You just have to work around that assumption that you will have a Chef server.
There we go. I think there was an organization, and I'm always struggling with who I can talk about and who I can't, but there is an organization that like very, very early on deployed Supermarket. I think they hacked around it by just basically making a modification in the code and just monkey patching the actual software to do the thing so that there was just a user and it was all good. Like that's how they worked around it.
Right, this is all workaroundable stuff. It's just Ruby code. It's really not that difficult code. All you have to do is find the right spot and put in the right thing to satisfy the assumption of the developer that you will have OAuth.
On that point, is OCID just OAuth? OAuth 2?
Chris would actually be better at answering that than me.
So OCID, so here's the thing. OCID is an OAuth 2 provider, but the key is, and this is the funny thing, is if you use Knife, you realize that you have a PEM file. We couldn't just use straight OAuth 2 because there's no PEM file. So OCID is OAuth 2 plus a PEM file. So it's what makes, it's the reason you have to use OCID instead of like OAuth 2 is because you need something that handles the PEM file.
Oh, that's totally workaroundable.
Yes. For knife, like knife. So they remove yes.
Right, everything that authenticates to the Chef server uses OCID. I believe even the front end.
I don't know if Manage does that yet. I know that that's on the roadmap.
It's on the roadmap, so if you walk really slowly back to your work or something, maybe it'll be implemented by then.
That's crazy that you say that because I've seen that happen where I've walked out of rooms and been like, oh, that thing we just talked about was implemented. Other questions? And just saying, I massively appreciate the work that was done on this. I got a chance to be part of the original team that launched Supermarket for Chef. How about that? And yeah, no, the amazing work being done by the community to deploy this in private situations has just been awesome.
Can you clarify what different purposes are served by uploading the same cookbook to both a chef server and a supermarket?
If you have your pipeline as the only source of uploads to the Chef server, then at some point your pipeline server, the thing in the middle, is going to need to run Burks up to get the dependencies for the cookbooks that you write and your wrappers and that sort of thing into the Chef server. So at the time that the cookbook that passes all these tests gets uploaded to the supermarket, it doesn't have to be sent to the Chef server. And in fact, at a couple of clients back, we absolutely did not upload it to the Chef server because there were many organizations on each Chef server, and they didn't all have the same cookbook requirements. And so it depends on your needs. I actually prefer not to have Jenkins upload the cookbooks to the Chef server as part of the supermarket flow, but that's going to vary based on your organization's needs.
If I could make a quick plug for delivery, because like the way I envision this as we move towards the delivery world, and Justin, thank you for letting me kind of jump in and hang with you.
Of course.
So this idea as you look at delivery and the idea of the different phases, in my ideal world, like we're not here yet, but my ideal world is that in the publish phase, you would push your artifact out to supermarket, and then in acceptance, the deploy phase would actually pull it from supermarket, because that would be supermarket's your actual artifact store. So yeah, I think that there's some like real neat synergies. Is that a word? Synergies? We'll go with it. To be had with that process, and supermarket being the place that you upload your artifacts to. I should check.
Oh, I have a question for all of you. Were you aware that New Context is hiring?
Now I am.
I'm right here. And here's how you can find me. If there are more questions, I'm always happy to answer them, or you can find me afterward.
Awesome. Thank you very much.